In Socorro County, New Mexico Territory, on a white afternoon in June of 1877, the town of Alamito sold a woman's debt on the courthouse steps, and the shadow of the Magdalena Mountains lay out east across the flat like something waiting to see what men would do. The heat came up off the caliche in sheets. There was the smell of horse and creosote and the sour cut of mescal from the saloon 2 doors down. And beneath it the dry mineral smell that country has in June, which is the smell of no rain coming. 60-odd people had gathered, most of them for the spectacle. A dog slept under the water trough and did not trouble himself. Boone Stillwell watched from the far end of the boardwalk, with his shoulder against a post and his hat down, and had no intention of opening his mouth. He was 41 years old, and had come down out of the Magdalenas that morning for coffee, powder, and a keg of nails, and he came down 4 times a year, and not 1 time more. He was a big, weathered man who had lived 11 years above 7,000 feet with 2 mules, a spring, and a dog, and Alamito had decided long ago that he was either a fugitive or a lunatic, and had never worked up the nerve to ask him which. The woman on the step was Catalina Reyes, and she was 26 years old, and she stood with her hands folded and her back straight and her chin level, while 4 men bid on her as though she were a wagon. Her father had been an apothecary in Mesilla. He had bought a share in the Buen Pastor mine in 1874 from a man who had no share to sell, and he had signed for $340 against his stock and his good name. And then he had died of the same summer fever that took 11 others in the valley, and the paper had come to Alamito with his daughter's name written under his. The county could not put a woman in the jail for a debt, but the county could sell the service of that debt for a term of 3 years, and Reverend Otis Pride had explained from his own pulpit that this was not only lawful but merciful, and Alamito had agreed with him, the way towns do. The bidding went to $210, then to $240. Ross Hagler, who had a hog farm and a wife already dead of him, went to $280. A freighter named Duke Ivers said $300 and looked around the crowd for approval and got it. They talked about her while they did it. That is the part the narrator would have you understand. They discussed her age and her health and whether the Mexican in her would tell against her in a kitchen. And they did it loudly, in front of her, in the manner of men who have never once considered that a thing being sold might be listening. She let them finish. When the auctioneer raised his hand to call it at $300, Catalina Reyes stepped forward 1 pace and spoke, and her voice was not loud, but the boardwalk heard it, and so did the men under the awning, and so did the dog under the trough, who lifted his head. "None of you," she said. The silence that fell over that street was of a particular kind, and everybody standing in it recognized it, which is why nobody moved. "My father owed $340, she said. He owed it to a swindler, and he owed it honestly, and I do not dispute it. I have offered this court my labor by contract, in writing, at wages, and this court has told me a woman cannot hold her own paper." She looked at the 4 men, one at a time, unhurried, the way a person reads a list. "So I will say the rest of it plainly, since you have all been speaking plainly enough about me. Whichever of you buys me will find he has bought 3 years of a woman who will not eat at his table, will not sit in his church, and will not forget 1 word said on this street today. You are welcome to that. It is a poor bargain, and I am telling you so before you make it." Reverend Prade came up off the bench, with his face gone the color of tallow. "You will hold your tongue. I have held it 40 minutes, sir," she said. "It has done nobody any good." And that was when Boone Stillwell came off the post. He crossed the street without hurrying, which took a while, and the crowd parted for him the way it does for weather. He did not look at Catalina Reyes. He went to the clerk's table, and he took a leather poke out of his coat, and he counted $340 in coin and small notes onto the boards, the whole of his hide money, a season and a half of trapping, and 11 months of packing ore for the Kelly camp, everything he had between that day and the following spring. "Debts paid," he said. "Write the receipt in her name." The clerk looked at Prade. Prade said, "Now hold on. Write it in her name." Boone said, "Or I will stand here till dark." The clerk wrote it. Boone took the paper, and he turned, and he put it into Catalina Reyes's hands, and he said the only other thing he said in that town all day. "You don't owe me nothing either." Wanted that clear in front of witnesses. Then he walked to his mules and began tying on his nails, because he had come for nails. She stood on the step, holding the receipt, while the crowd worked out what it thought. Ross Hagler spat. Duke Ivers laughed once, unpleasantly. Reverend Prade said something about the appearance of sin that carried further than he intended. And Catalina Reyes, who owned nothing at all in the world now, except a paid receipt, a bundle of clothes, and a black basalt molcajete that had ground medicine for 3 generations of her mother's family and weighed 11 pounds. Picked up all 3 and walked down the steps and across the street to where the mountain man was tying his load. "Where is your place?" she said. He did not look up from the knot. "Magdalena's. Day and a half up. There's a second cabin from when my partner was living. Roof sound. Door bars from the inside. And your terms? Ain't got any." He pulled the knot tight. "You can ride the near mule. You can turn around at the switchbacks and come back down, and I'll bring you. Nobody's holding paper on you, ma'am. Not them, and not me." Catalina Reyes looked back once at Alamito, at the courthouse steps, at the 4 men, at the preacher watching from the shade with his hat in his hand, and then she handed Boone Stillwell an 11-pound stone bowl and said, "Then I will need help with this." He took it under one arm like it weighed nothing and set it in the pack, and they went up out of the valley together in the last 4 hours of light, and the town watched them go the whole way to the bend. The trail climbed through juniper, then pion, then into the tall pines, where the air changed temperature so suddenly that she felt it on her arms and drew breath in surprise. He heard her do it and said nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders eased. They camped that night below the saddle. He built the fire and gave her the tarp and the wool, and slept on the bare ground on the far side of the flames with his hat over his face, and when she woke twice in the night, he was exactly where he had been, and each time she saw it, she slept sounder after. His place lay in a park of grass at 8,000 feet, with a spring running out of rock at the head of it, a corral, a low cabin of squared pine, and a second smaller cabin 30 yards off with a stovepipe and a good door. There were 9 hides drying on frames. There was a dog, grey around the muzzle, who came out and inspected Catalina Reyes with enormous seriousness, and then leaned his whole weight against her leg, which Boone said afterward was the fastest he had ever seen that animal make up his mind about anybody. She swept out the second cabin. She hung her clothes on nails. She set the molcajete on the plank shelf by the window where the light came in, and the sight of it sitting there, black, heavy, worn to a shine in the bowl, in a room 8,000 feet above the town that had tried to sell her, did something to her composure that the auction had not managed, and she stood with her hands on the plank shelf until it passed. That first evening he fried salt pork and made coffee, and they ate on the step, and he did not ask her a single question about herself, which she noticed and was grateful for. She asked him one instead. "How do you want to be addressed?" "Boone's fine." "Then Boone." She set down her cup. I am Catalina Reyes. Not the Reyes woman, which is what they say down there. Catalina. He turned the name over once, carefully, the way a man handles something borrowed. Catalina, he said. Later, when he rose to bank the fire, she watched him favor the left knee he had been favoring since the switchbacks, and she said, "That is not age. That is a joint that was opened and closed badly." Who sewed it? Boone stopped with the poker in his hand. Fella at Fort Craig, he said. Drunk? I can do better than a drunk at Fort Craig. Not tonight. But before winter. She stood and gathered the plates. You will want to be walking on that in 10 years. He stood there a while after she had gone in, listening to the spring run, thinking about the fact that no living soul had said the word winter to him in the sense of your winter in 11 years. What followed was a summer, and the narrator will not pretend it was eventful, because it was not, and that was the whole of its worth. She turned 4 rods of ground beside the second cabin and put in yerba mansa and osha root and horehound and mint, and she went up the drainages after what she could not plant. She learned the mules. She rebuilt the springboks in stone and juniper so the water ran cold and clean into a basin instead of spreading into a bog, and it was better work than Boone had done in 11 years. And both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. In July, a boy from the Kelly camp came up the trail with a forearm scalded to the elbow by a steam line, brought by his father because a man in the camp had said there was a curandera on the mountain. She worked on that arm for 2 hours. She did not let them pay her. In August, she set the collarbone of a mescalero rider who had come off a horse in the pass, and she asked him his name, and used it, and sent him off with a packet of the horehound. And Boone watched all of that from the corral and said afterward only, most folks around here wouldn't have. Most folks around here are wrong about a great many things, said Catalina Reyes. In the last week of August, the grey dog did not come when Boone called him, and was found at noon under the corral rail, with his flank opened from the ribs back, and a smell coming off him, that Boone had smelled before on animals that did not recover. He had gone into something in the night, a badger, most likely, or a cat coming down for water, and he was 14 years old, and he had been the only living thing on that mountain that Boone Stillwell spoke to out loud. Boone came out of the shed with the rifle. Put it down, said Catalina Reyes. He's open to the bone. I know what he is open to. I have been looking at him for 10 minutes, and you have been looking at him for 1. She was already rolling her sleeves. Boil water. All of it, and bring me the good lamp, and then take that rifle back where you got it. Because you are not going to need it today, and I will not work with it leaning on the wall. She worked on that dog for 3 hours on the plank table, with the lamp burning at midday and the flies coming to the screen. She trimmed and flushed and drew the muscle wall together in 2 layers, and she used a stitch Boone had never seen anybody use, small and doubled back on itself, and she talked the whole time in a low, steady Spanish that was not for him, and not, he suspected, entirely for the dog either. At the end of it she straightened, and put her hands in the small of her back, and said, 4 days. If he is standing on the 4th day, he will be standing at Christmas. He was standing on the 3rd. Boone Stillwell sat on the step that evening with a 14-year-old dog leaning against his leg, and a woman washing lamp black off her forearms in the basin behind him, and he understood, with a plainness that startled him, that he was going to be no good at all at going back to how it had been. They fell into the habit of the evening step. She would bring the coffee out and hand it across, and their fingers did not meet, though both of them knew precisely where the others were, and they would sit and watch the light go off the peaks in that order it goes. Gold, then rose, then a blue that is not any other blue. and say perhaps 9 sentences between them in an hour. One evening in early September, without preamble, she said, "There is diphtheria in Alamito." Boone set his cup down. There was a child on the courthouse steps in June, 4 rows back, with a gray membrane in his throat and his neck swollen out to here. She held 2 fingers apart. I saw it while they were bidding. I have thought about it every day since. In a town with 1 well and 1 schoolroom, by September it will be in 11 houses. She looked at the dark shape of the valley below them, 16 miles off and 4,000 feet down. The child was the Reverend's. Boone Stillwell sat with that a long moment. Then he said the thing that had been forming in him since the courthouse steps and had finally found its words. "You saw all that," he said, "while they were selling you." "I am a physician's daughter and a curandera's daughter both," she said. "I do not stop being either one because a man with a gavel would prefer it. Before the world came up that mountain, and it did, and sooner than either of them was ready for, there were a few more evenings on that step, with the coffee going cold and the peaks turning that particular blue. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a while longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything. And if you find yourself moved by tales of love that survived the worst the West could throw at them, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this." They came up on the 2nd Sunday in September, 7 of them, with Reverend Otis Praed at the front on a borrowed sorrel. He was a lean, sun-scoured man of 60, with a good voice and an absolute certainty, and he had preached 3 weeks running on the Sin at the head of the Magdalena Spring, and by the 3rd week, the mercantile in Alamito had stopped extending Boone Stillwell credit, and the freighter had refused to haul his hides at any price. Praed did not dismount. He looked at the garden, and the 2nd cabin, and the woman standing in the door of it with her hands wet from the basin. "There is sickness in my town," he said, "in my own house. Children are choking to death in their beds, and it began the very week that woman stood on the courthouse steps and cursed the town of Alamito out loud in front of 60 witnesses. She didn't curse nobody," Boone said. "She turned down 4 men. Ain't the same thing, though I see how it sting. She is a bruja and a debtor, and she is living unmarried on your land. She's living in her own cabin, on her own terms, and the door bars from the inside." Boone had not raised his voice, and did not. "You want to know what I say about it, Reverend? Here it is. She's with me. That's the whole of it, and it ain't going to get longer. Then you are ruined in that valley, Stillwell, I will see to it. Been ruined in that valley 11 years. Hadn't noticed the difference." Boone stepped down off the porch. "Now ride off my mountain." They went. It took a while, and there was talk on the way, and one of the men turned in the saddle at the tree line and made a gesture at the 2nd cabin. And Catalina saw it. She also saw what it cost. She saw the empty place in the shed where the hides had been stacked to go down to the freighter and now would not. She saw him count the flour. 3 days later, she walked 11 miles down the north drainage to the freighter's camp at Water Canyon, and she came back after dark with 40 pounds of flour, 20 of beans, and coffee, and when Boone asked her how, she turned her head so he could see that the small gold hoops she had worn since she was 15, her mother's and her grandmother's before that, were gone from her ears. He did not say thank you. He understood that it had not been done to be thanked for. He went out and split wood until it was too dark to see the block. The talk came at the spring, at the end of that week, in the cold blue hour before supper. "You have not asked me why I did not simply pay the debt myself," Catalina said. "I had a way. There was a man in Masia who would have married me and paid it in a morning. Figured that was your business." "It is. I am making it yours." She sat on the stone of the spring box she had built. In the spring of 75, there was a foreman at the Buen pasture named Wills who beat a boy of 13 half to death over a dropped lamp. 2 weeks later, Wills came to my father's door at night with a rope burn gone septic in his hand and a fever, and my father was already dying in the back room, and I was the one who opened the door. She looked at her palms. I told him I could not help him. It was a lie, Boone. I could have opened that hand and drawn it, and he would have lived. I stood in my own doorway, and I chose, and he died on the 9th of April, and I have not been certain since that day whether I am a healer or a murderer, and I have not said that sentence out loud to one living person until now. The spring ran. Somewhere down the park a mule shifted and blew. 71, Boone said. I guided a party of 11 out of the bosque toward the Gila. Come on a mescalero camp that was half women. I told them plain what those people were. I told them twice. He was looking straight ahead at the rock. Then I got on my horse, and I rode a 1/4 mile off, and I sat there, and I let it happen. Because I was one man, and they were 11, and I have never once in 6 years been able to decide whether that was arithmetic or cowardice. 2 of them was children. Catalina, I come up this mountain the following spring, and I have not gone down but 4 times a year since, and every one of them times I have been glad to leave. He turned and looked at her. So I ain't the man to tell you what you are, he said, but I know what I seen in that valley in June. Whatever you was carrying, you stood up under it in front of 4 men and a preacher, and you kept your feet. That's the only kind of good I believe in anymore, and I have been 11 years working out that I believe in anything. Catalina Reyes crossed the 4 feet of ground between them herself, and the narrator sets that down plainly. Because there was nothing in the world compelling her to do it, and a great deal that might have argued against. What passed between them then was brief, and was not repeated that evening, and what broke open in her was not longing, but the enormous quiet astonishment of being known all the way down and not let go of. The diphtheria came up the mountain on the 29th of September in the form of a 14-year-old boy from the Kelly camp who rode a mule to death getting there. She was gone in 20 minutes. She took the molcajete and the case of tinctures and every yard of clean muslin in both cabins, and Boone saddled the good horse and rode down beside her in the dark, and neither of them said a word for 16 miles. The mob was waiting at the edge of Alamito. That is the shape of the thing, and there is no use dressing it otherwise. Otis Prade had buried a child of his own on the 27th, and grief in a certain kind of man does not go inward, and he had spent 2 days telling the town whose fault it was. There were 19 men on that road, with lanterns, and 4 with rifles, and they meant to turn her back, or worse. Boone Stillwell put his horse across the road in front of her. He talked to them for a full minute, calm as a stone, and the narrator would like to report that talk was enough. It was not. A rifle went off. Nobody in Alamito would ever agree afterward whose, and Boone came off the horse into the road with a ball through the meat above his hip and his leg gone out from under him. The lanterns all stopped moving at once, the way they do when men understand what they have done. Catalina Reyes was off her mule and in the dirt of that road with her hands inside his coat before the echo had come back off the mesa. She found the wound and packed it and bound it with the muslin she had brought for children's throats, and got 2 men she had never spoken to in her life to lift him into the back of the freighter's wagon, and she did all of it without one word to the 19 men standing there with their lanterns and their rifles and their faces. Then she stood up in the road, blood to the elbows, and she spoke to them for the 2nd time in her life. There are 11 houses in this town with sick children in them, she said. I know which 11. I have known since June. Every one of you go to your own house and open every window and boil every kettle you own, and if there is a child in it that cannot swallow, you carry that child to the schoolroom. And you carry it now and I will be there in a quarter hour." Nobody argued with her. 19 men and 4 rifles, and not one of them argued. They brought Boone into the back of the schoolroom on a door taken off its hinges, because there was nowhere else in Alamito she could be, and watch him at the same time. And she put him behind a hung blanket in the corner, and did not look at him again for 4 hours. And he lay there, in and out of it, listening to her voice going steadily on the other side of that blanket, giving orders to a town that had tried to sell her, and every man in it doing what she said. She worked in that schoolroom for 3 days and 2 nights. Steam kettles in every corner until the windows ran and the wallpaper peeled, swabbing membrane off the backs of throats, hour after hour, with a mixture out of the black bowl her great-grandmother had ground in. Water, 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 spooned in every 20 minutes to children too weak to ask. 11 children came in. 9 walked out. 2 did not, and she washed them herself and carried them out to their mothers in her own arms, and she never once afterward described those 3 days as a victory. Reverend Otis Pride carried water for her. That is the fact of it. He had 2 more children in that room, and he carried water for the woman he had tried to sell, for 2 nights, and neither of them said anything about it at the time or ever. He resigned his pulpit in November and left the territory in the spring, and the sheriff of Socorro County, who had held the horses for the mob and had thought about it a great deal since, let him go. 9 families in Alamito had reason after that to be careful about the words they used. And they were. By the following June, the story of what happened on the courthouse steps had gotten around Socorro County in a form somewhat improved by telling, and the version that stuck was the true one, which does not always happen. They were married at the spring in the park at 8,000 feet on a Sunday in June of 1878 by a circuit preacher out of Socorro who came up the trail on a borrowed mule and said afterward that it was the finest church he had ever stood in. 22 people made the climb. 9 of them were children who had walked out of that schoolroom. The freighter came and hauled the whole load of hides down after and would not take money for it. Boone Stillwell walked with a stick that summer and would walk with a limp the rest of his life, and his wife, who had opened and reset the badly sewn knee in February, as promised, considered the limp her own personal failure, and said so about twice a year for 40 years. He spoke exactly 1 sentence in front of all 22 of them, and it was her name, entire, Catalina Reyes, said slowly and correctly and out loud, in a valley where for a year they had called her only the Reyes woman. And there were people standing on that grass who cried at it and could not have told you why. They kept the mountain. She would not leave the spring, and he would not have asked her to. But 2 days of every week she went down, and by the autumn of 1879 there was a whitewashed room behind the Mercantile in Alamito with a plank counter and a shelf of blue glass bottles and a hand-lettered board over the door that read Botica Reyes, because she had paid for it out of her own earnings and saw no earthly reason to letter it any other way. On the plank counter, in the light of the one window, sat a molcajete of black basalt, worn smooth in the bowl by 4 generations of hands, hauled down that mountain on a mule by a man who had carried it up in the first place under one arm as though it weighed nothing at all. Their daughter was born in 1880 and grew up grinding osha root in that bowl. She was the one who took it to Albuquerque in 1911 and put it on her own counter, and told the story to anyone who asked what a stone bowl was doing in a modern dispensary, and she told it the same way every time. It began, there were 4 men bidding, and 1 man leaning on a post who did not say a word until it counted. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out in the Magdalena Mountains of New Mexico, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was. The love between Boone Stillwell and Catalina Reyes became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real. Though they did remember it in that valley for a very long while. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.